Hello, everyone, and welcome to Persuasive Communications. My name is Mirjana Pantic. Again, you can call me Professor Pantic or Dr. Pantic. Let me tell you a story before I start another lecture about persuasive communications. So, the first time I thought persuasive communications was in 2017. I just graduated at that time from the University of Tennessee, where I obtained my PhD, and I started working at Pace University. So they asked me to teach persuasive communications. I wasn't sure which book to use for the course, so I got in touch with one of the people I respected the most, my now late professor, Dr. Ron Taylor. So he directed me at some books, and then I decided to use Richard Perloff and his book on attitude change. But also, Dr. Taylor said that, Mira, you should look at um, Carlins and Appleson and their book about opinion and attitude change. That book dates back to 1970. And at first I thought like, should I use this book? But he actually said, even though the book is very old, it's still very relevant. And once I started reading the book, I realized why. It's very interesting. It's a collection of many studies, experimental studies about persuasive communications. And I decided not to ask you to read the full book, but I kind of selected some pieces of the book for you to read. And I also included many interesting tips from the book into my PowerPoint presentation. So, and also like some of the book chapters are selected for your exercises. I really like the book, and one of the reasons I actually decided to, I really respected Dr. Taylor. He was an amazing person, an amazing professor, but also I totally understand what he was implying when he said, and this is still relevant, the way messages are crafted and the way people, by their nature, react to them has probably not changed much since 1970s. So that's the intro to another lecture. Let me share my screen with you so we can start talking about it. What I prepared for you for today is a conversation about audiences and persuasion tips. Okay, let me go to the slide mode. All right. Let's start with the question. What, in your opinion, what characteristics of an audience should a speaker analyze to shape persuasive messages? And these characteristics, how are they going to help a speaker choose effective strategies to ensure that the audience accepts the message and acts accordingly? Let's take a look at some of the main characteristics. So, what do we need to know about audiences? Remember, your messages to a great extent depends on the people you're addressing. So, one thing you should know about the audience is how they feel about the topic that you're discussing. And then, what are their values? What is it that they think is right and what is wrong? Another thing is knowledge. What you need to know is what your audience already knows about the topic. Because if they are very knowledgeable about the topic, you might select arguments differently and you might not spend time elaborating on the basics versus talking to an audience about that doesn't have that much knowledge about the topic. You need to introduce them to the basic concepts of what you're going to discuss. Then we need to take into consideration their interest level, the extent to which they really care about the topic. So if I'm, let's say, want to learn more about running, and I'm a runner, so I already have like a really solid amount of knowledge about running, but I want to learn something new. So my interest level is high because I've been a runner for more than a decade and I run marathons. So my interest level is high. So I really would care deeply about the topic. And since I'm knowledgeable about it, the communicator addressing me and other people in the audience needs to really bring something new to the discussion. It has to be some interesting example, good argument that would make me even more engaged. So the interest level is important. Or let's say if I'm going to just go to like a meetup that about something that I'm not that interested in, then the speaker should take that into consideration and make like mention some really engaging examples and share some interesting tips to make me interested in the topic. We also need to consider audiences' needs and motivations, what they really want or what they stand to gain or lose. If you are, let's say, promoting a campaign against smoking, and if I'm the person, if there are people in the audience who are really eager to quit smoking, you need to take into consideration their needs and motivations. So, what are they going to, by quitting smoking, what is it that they're going to gain or lose, and so on. We also need to take into consideration the demographics of the audience. That includes their age, their gender, level of education, their socioeconomic status, national or cultural background. So these are some of the key elements to consider when crafting a message. Now, let's take a look at the audiences and what do we know about them. One of the things to learn about an audience is to what extent they are susceptible to persuasion. How does it differ? Like, are we as people more or less susceptible to persuasion? What plays an important role in susceptibility to persuasion is our personality. So personality differences affect susceptibility to persuasion. Those personality traits might include, according to Collins and Abelson, intelligence, authoritarianism, and integrative complexity. Now, let me explain each of these in more detail. According to Collins and Abelson, people who are more intelligent and extroverted are more persuasive and less persuadable. So they're more prone to persuading others. They have qualities required to persuade other people in their ideas, but it is more challenging to persuade them than people who are less intelligent. Also, the most intelligent people will be the least influenced by propaganda. And what is it that we learned about propaganda? It basically picks certain segments of reality, amplifies them. It relies on deception, mass media to spread messages, and so on. People who are intelligent will be more influenced by the arguments if they are exposed to persuasive communication, which relies primarily on impressive logical arguments, because they have greater ability to draw valid inferences than less intelligent people. So, for example, people who are very intelligent are not accepting conspiracies just like that. So they're not accepting conspiracies. So when you are in your message to them, in your speech, you need to make sure that you're including very logical arguments backed up by strong examples, because based on those arguments, they will make inferences and they have a greater ability to draw valid inferences than less intelligent people. Another thing is that highly intelligent people will also be less influenced when exposed to communication, which relies on unsupported generalities or false arguments, and this include conspiracy theories. Let's take a look at authoritarianism and how that affects people's perception of persuasive messages. When it comes to an authoritarian personality, and remember, you need to distinguish between authority and an authoritarian personality. So these are different things. And authority can be reflected in your boss at work who has like who has been in the company for decades, who knows the job well, and who's prominent in the field. So that's an authority. An authority can be also your professor who is knowledgeable in the field, has experience teaching, knows how to transfer knowledge to you, and so on. But an authoritarian personality is very different. These people are actually those who are prone to accept everything that comes from an authority consciously. They admire an authority unconsciously. They're not, they hate them in a way. So an authoritarian personality, an authoritarian person is somebody who is demonstrates weakness and acceptance of an authority. They would do whatever an authority tells them to do. So they're really afraid of them. But then on the other hand, they will completely be hostile towards people um, who are like on a hierarchical level under them. So let's say an example of an authoritarian individual could be if you have a professor who demonstrates rigidity, authority, and you're like a type of person, like an authoritarian type of person, would be really afraid of them. But then, if that authoritarian type of person, let's say, is the leader of a group in class, then they would demonstrate the same behavior, be rigid, be hostile toward those group members that are at that point, because this is like the group leader, like a bit lower. So on that short-term hierarchical scale. So basically, authoritarian individuals have an unquestioned respect for people in authority or those in power. So what does it mean? Even if you have a dictator, an authoritarian leader as the president of your country or a club that you're a member of, you still, regardless of many of their flaws, you still respect them and you're still being submissive to them. So just like you expect of people who are at the hierarchical level, like a bit lower than you also expect of them to show unquestioned respect towards you. Authoritarian people are also more likely to be persuaded by authority figures, while non-authoritarian individuals rely more on the information or arguments provided on the issue in question, which means people who are authoritarian, they basically, to them, it's frequently sufficient to receive an information from the authority, and they're likely to accept it instantly. But on the other hand, people who are not authoritarian, it's not sufficient to them just to receive that information from an authority, but they also need to know what are the reasons behind that. So they need specific arguments to be persuaded. It's not sufficient for them just to receive that from an authority, but these arguments need to be backed up with sufficient claims. And finally, the third component is integrative complexity. That basically refers to the way a person thinks. Do you think in abstract or concrete categories? The method by which they seek and utilize information in their life. This is a cognitive process that assesses an individual's ability to think about the problem by differentiating its various components and integrating them into a new perspective. So, to what extent can you dissect the problem and look at from a different angles and incorporate some new information into that and integrate them into a new perspective? Those people who are high in integrated complexity, they're called abstract individuals, while people who are low on integrative complexity are called concrete. So a concrete person is relatively rigid, and yes, it is likely to be an authoritarian type of personality. They're closed-minded, while on the other hand, an abstract individual is creative. So, in your opinion, based on this, who do you think would be easily swayed by a propaganda appeal? We'll talk more about it in class, but just think about it. Who would be more swayed, an abstract or a concrete individual? And another thing to take into consideration when it comes to audiences is selective exposure. And there are two different things with respect to selective or exposure that I'm going to discuss. The first one is that the people you may want most in your audience are often least likely to be there. If we're talking about quitting smoking or quitting drinking, for example, that means you're unlikely to encounter those people who need this help the most. And that's the problem. So, selective exposure basically means that people tend to expose themselves only to persuasive appeals with which they already agree. What does it mean? When you read Perloff, you have encountered so many contemporary examples, including the right to abortion, and George Floyd's murder. So there's so many examples, and then when we look into them, there were so many contemporary examples in his book, and then when we look into them, and when we think about persuasive messages, so if those people who are pro-choice or pro-life, are they, or pro-life, are they going to expose themselves to the opposite, to, like, just imagine, are they going to go to a conference in their town, to a gathering in their town, to a round table or whatever other type of discussion is there, to hear different opinions? I'm not sure about that, because they're more likely to go to those meetups, meetings, roundtables that will simply confirm their already established attitudes. So, as individuals, and we do the same thing on social media, on digital platforms, we look for information that will simply bolster our already established attitude. So, selective exposure implies that we're going to expose ourselves to those persuasive appeals to which we already agree. There are several experiments, even back then in the 70s, that confirmed that people tend to expose themselves to sources of information congruent with their own beliefs. And I believe that that is even more pronounced today, because we have all these social media platforms and algorithms that basically select content for us based on our preferences. And we also tend to look for information that is in line with what we already believe in. What really happens when an individual hears two differing viewpoints? So, this is another form of selective exposure. The individual attends to those segments of the communication that support their views. So, that is this selective perception that they have. And then they perceive and recall information only if it reinforces their prior images, which is selective memory. So let's say, let's say if you are progressive and you hear certain conservative ideas and you compare them to those progressive ideas that you embrace, you're definitely, first of all, you're more likely to simply focus on news stories, Instagram accounts that are progressive as well, because this is where your political ideas fall into it, they fall into that spectrum. But then also, when you're trying to recall some information, you're way more likely to select from your memory the information that aligns with what you believe in, with your progressive ideas. And also, the individual attends to segments of the communication that distort statements to eliminate dissonant materials. So these ideas, I don't like them, I'm just gonna try to eliminate them. So in that sense, even our thought process, the process in which we decide what we're going to look for, what we're going to remember, and what is it that we're going to simply reject, that process is also selective. It reflects selective exposure. So not just our readiness to look for information that aligns with our beliefs, not our readiness to like go to events that will support what we already, or roundtables, meetups, and et cetera, that will support what we already believe in. But even when we try to derive some information from our memory, we do the same. We selectively pick information that align uh, with our beliefs, with our attitudes. Or in brief, people hear what they want to hear. When Carlins and Abelson, so this is uh, like one issue that I need to point at. When they were writing their book, they argued that women were more persuadable than men. So we were looking here at personality characteristics that are really, that kind of stand the test of time. Um, we talked about people who are more abstract, more um, highly intelligent, and how they predominantly rely on arguments, as well as people who are not authoritarian. But this is something that stands the test of time. When they discussed men and women and how women were more persuadable than men, we need to put that into a different context. And they emphasized in the book that this was not due to any psychological factors. So it's not that one is definitely um, psychologically determined to be more persuadable than other. It is the societal and cultural norms at the time in America that made women more persuadable than men. So it would be really interesting to see more recent research in this area. So at that time in the 70s, parenting styles and cultural expectations would encourage women to act submissively and to go back to that authoritarian personality. It's an authoritarian personality that is also more persuadable. They are submissive to authority, and they also tend to demonstrate their authority over somebody who is under them in a way, like it can be at work, in school, and so on. So, but basically, when it comes to women, it's definitely, this needs to be placed in a cultural context. It would be interesting to see research today when women are independent, and how persuadable they are in comparison to men. But again, like this is really connected to that specific period of time in America. Another thing to consider are attitudes, and we're going to talk about them in more detail this semester because that is the whole point of persuasion, how to change people's attitudes and behavior. Those who are successful in persuasion not only consider an individual's attitude, but also the reasons behind those attitudes. So it's not just enough to know what kind of attitude a person has, but also what are the reasons behind those attitudes. Let me give you an example. Like when I go back to go back to running. So some people run because they want to, like that's the only way for them to socialize with others. Some people run because, or the best way to socialize with others. Some people run because they want to maintain weight. Some people run because they run in college, so it's just part of their routine, or they just want to continue with that. It's kind of their passion about it. So knowing these things, the reasons why people run, are going to help you establish your message, whether you're going to focus on in case of maintaining or losing weight, whether you're going to focus on certain running routines, and how a person, like provide examples of people who are very fit or who lost weight because they would run 20, 30 miles a week, 40 miles a week, and so on? Or are you going to focus on social aspect of it in case people run because their main focus is to really keep that social connection with other runners? They feel accepted, they feel they're doing something meaningful, they feel like they're battling their loneliness through running, and so on. So it's really important to know how attitudes develop, so you know how they develop and what are people's reasons for holding certain attitudes in order to have an impact on them, in order to craft a message. Successful propaganda comes from knowing what is behind the attitude. So it's the same applies to persuasion. So propaganda is basically a negative concept, persuasion is positive, but we also, to be effective in persuasion, we need to know what lies behind that attitude. People have a particular set of attitudes because they help them make meaning of facts. So there are factual reasons why they have certain attitudes, and they allow people to fit into certain groups, social, like I mentioned, running clubs. And they also help the individual provide a rationalization for their shortcomings. So it's the so-called ego defensive motivation. Now, at this point of the lecture, I want you to pay close attention because I have an exercise for you for this week. So I want you to pay close attention to the following tips I will give you. Listen attentively, pick 3 tips from this video that I'm going to discuss and elaborate on them in the form of the discussion posts, adding examples to illustrate your point. Just one discussion post. Write an essay of about 300 words and post it under persuasion tips. So let's see what kind of persuasion tips I have for you. We talked a little bit about audience, and basically, as I mentioned, the most important thing about audiences is how to change their attitudes, how to impact their behavior. But how are we going to craft messages? What are some persuasive tips that we need to take into consideration? I talked a lot about arguments and how important they are, especially for highly intelligent, non-authoritarian people, those who think in abstract categories, who are able to connect the dots. What kind of arguments are we going to present? Should we, and in which cases we're presenting one-sided arguments, in which cases we are supposed to present two-sided arguments. What Carlins and Abelson argue is that when the audience is generally friendly to you, when your position is the only one that will be presented, or when you want immediate, though temporary opinion change, present one side of the argument. So remember your friendly audience, those people who mostly already agree with you, it is sufficient to present a one-sided argument. But when the audience initially disagrees with you, or when it is probable that the audience will hear the other side from someone else, present both sides of the argument. So if you know they have a chance, so they already know what's the other argument, make sure to present them both. And what is important is emphasize your argument, but also acknowledge the other side, and then explain why what you claim makes more sense, is more valid and more important, more helpful to them. Now, should the argument be at the beginning or the end? It really depends. It depends on many variables. Sometimes it is better to present arguments at the beginning and sometimes at the end. When an audience is not really interested in what you have to say, they're there, but they're not super interested in that topic, it is definitely better to present the major arguments at the beginning. So try to tell at the beginning what are your key arguments. Share that at the beginning to spark their interest. But if the audience is highly interested, you can present main arguments at the end. In fact, if you want your argument to be remembered, it is better to present it at the beginning or the end rather than in the middle of the speech. And this one is really important. We often talk about conclusions. We talk about conclusions in journalism. When do we have them? When do we not? Oh, this journalistic format is not supposed to allow us to have a conclusion, this journalistic format, but journalism is not persuasive communication. There are other messages that we often discuss, advertising, public relations. Like, are there any other messages or speeches, like when do we need to have conclusions? Like, you notice probably that even when I create my lectures, I try to have some conclusions or discuss key concepts at the end. Why? Because I want you to remember them. And I want you to think of the major main points of the lecture. So should I state any conclusions? What do we do in case of persuasion? There'll probably be more opinion change in the direction you want if you explicitly state your conclusions than if you let the audience draw their own. So as Carlos and Abelson say it is really important to state them because it will have an impact on opinion change. But it is better to draw conclusions as this increases the likelihood that they understand what you want them to do. Still, it's not always the best solution to draw conclusions. So there are definitely arguments pro drawing conclusions. So as I mentioned, just like in case of where the argument should be, it really depends. But there are cases, even when it comes to conclusions, where you maybe should not, should avoid drawing them. In which cases we should avoid drawing conclusions. For instance, if the audience is hostile or suspicious, they may view your conclusions as propaganda. So let them think. Don't imply what they should think about and what conclusions they should have. If the audience is sophisticated, they could perceive your conclusions as an insult to their intelligence. But still, so you don't need to go into the basics. You can still draw conclusions, just don't oversimplify it. But also, if the conclusions are left unsaid with the same audience, they might think something is being withheld from them. So that's why you should still draw conclusions. It's just don't be as basic. Don't be as too like don't make evident things even more evident. Like try to draw conclusions in a way that will acknowledge their sophistication and intelligence, but also point at your key arguments and the fact that you're not hiding anything from them. It is a good idea to state conclusions when the communicator is unsure of the intelligence of the audience or how easily they will understand the argument. So this is definitely when you need to state conclusions. So if you are not sure about your audience fully, if you don't have a complete perception of them and their intelligence, or you don't know how easily they will understand arguments, then definitely make sure that you have state conclusions. Remember also, in many situations, when you're addressing other people, when you're delivering a lecture or a speech, it's always like pay attention to their reactions, and they, aside from like having some background information about your audience, pay attention to their reactions as you deliver that speech, because that will also tell you a lot about your audience. Another interesting tip for a persuasion tip is distraction. Pleasant form of distractions can often increase the effectiveness of persuasive appeal. So some form of distraction, and such form of distraction is when business people organize lunch with their clients. When they're about to close the deal, they frequently do so over dessert. This rewarding stimulus, which serves as a distractor, can enhance the effectiveness of persuasion. You probably also noticed that many events that are being organized are usually involve some food, either to persuade people to come to that event, like, oh, there's free food, free coffee, free pizza, or it is because it's kind of, if you have a specific idea that you want to make sure they come across and that they're going to impact people's attitudes and behavior, then you want to have these small distractions that would make them more prone to accept your ideas. One more important tip to have when it comes to persuasion is active participation. It's always better to make sure your audience is engaged, not just that you're the one talking, but that they're active participants in that message. So the impact of persuasive appeal is enhanced by requiring active rather than passive participation by the listener. How do we achieve this? Ask them questions, ask them for their opinion, ask them to share some experience. A group discussion as a form of active participation is more effective than passive participation. A person who actively engages with the situation often changes their attitudes about it. So, what are key points from this lecture? Know your audience. So we need to know their attitudes, their level of knowledge. The more we know, the better we are prepared. We need to know the demographics, needs, and motivations, and their interest level in the topic. Another thing to consider is susceptibility to persuasion when crafting a message. Factors such as intelligence, authoritarianism, and integrative complexity are going to have an impact of whether a person is going to accept the message or reject it. Selective exposure implies that people tend to expose themselves to persuasive messages they already agree with. Also, that they selectively use messages from their memory, relying mostly on what aligns with their beliefs. Present both sides of the argument if the audience disagrees with you. Present one side if you're with the friendly audience. When it comes to drawing conclusions, it really is best to draw conclusions for the audience unless they're hostile or sophisticated in some cases. Leaving conclusions implicit may be more effective. And finally, active participation contributes to more effective persuasion. This is my reference for today, so I relied on Dr. Taylor's recommendation, Persuasion, How Opinions and Attitudes Are Changed. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions for me, or if you need me to clarify anything further, please feel free to reach out. Have a great week. Bye-bye.